I'll call this special regional council meeting to order. Developing meaningful relations with our Indigenous neighbors is a priority of the Northern Rockies Region municipality. As such, we are collaborating with First Nations governments and Indigenous organizations to develop a respectful and meaningful territorial acknowledgement. This work also presents an opportunity to learn more about the culture and history of the Indigenous people of our region. Please be advised that tonight's meeting is available for the public to attend virtually, is being streamed and recorded. Can I get a motion, please, to adopt the agenda? Moved by Councillor Andrews, seconded by Councillor Souls. All those in favor? Carried. Tonight, we have a delegation from Forestry, Mr. Chris Cooper. It is good to see you, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Doug Boorhill, Director of Regional Development, Ministry of the Environment, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. And believe Lana Lowe, Director of Lands, Fort Nelson First Nations, is also with us today. Oh, I'll do some introductions for Mr. Boorhill. This is Councillor Gerwing, Councillor Andrews, Councillor Souls, our CAO, Mr. Barry, and our Corporate Services Manager, Mrs. McIver.
Hello. Hello.
Mr. Cooper, did you want to kick things off?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. Thanks, Gary. And it's good to see everybody again. Thanks for making time and space for us today to come and talk further the conversations on the boreal caribou planning that's taken place so far, and kind of where we're headed and what's next. Also, I think joining us is Joelle Sheck. Joelle Ward, who's also she's the lead for caribou planning in the north area for the Ministry of Land, Water, and Resource Stewardship. So I sent, hey Joelle, thanks. So I sent Lisa a copy of this PowerPoint. Not for sure how you guys want to do it. I can share my screen probably and walk through that, or did you want to have the run through?
That would be all right. If you want to share your screen, Chris, that'd be fine.
Okay. Let me just figure out how to do that. This should work. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
I just lost, so I think I can still, yeah, I can kind of see everybody there. So as I go through the PowerPoint here, I'll speak to most of the slides. Doug will obviously speak to some of them, and then Joelle may add to this conversation too. It's kind of hard to see you guys all in the room there on the little screen. So if at any time during this you have questions, you don't have to wait till the end till we're done. Just speak up and let me know that you want to, you know, if you have a question or if you want us to elaborate on a particular topic, we'll just do that as we go along. So what we are talking about today, again, is the Boreal Caribou Protection and Recovery Plan for the Northern Rockies Council. And the topics that we're going to go through in this presentation, well, I'll talk a little bit about the current process timelines, where we're at, what the next steps are, and sort of our projections for timelines to date. We'll talk a little bit about the public and stakeholder engagement that we conducted, look a little bit at some of the responses and sort of the themes and where we're going from there. Then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Doug Boorhill from Energy, Mines, and Low Carbon Initiative to speak to the PNG and aggregate resource access and projections and where things are going there. We'll get into the implementation phase of this plan. So this would be after the province has endorsed it to move forward, then we go into some implementation. So we talk a little bit about that. We'll speak a little bit about predator management planning, what we have on the books, as well as the future of predator management planning. And then we'll finish up by talking about the socioeconomic assessments that have been done and sort of what we need to look at going forward. So starting with the current process and timelines, so we have conducted a round of public and stakeholder engagement. And I say we've conducted a round because this, so engagement is always ongoing. There's the opportunity for more discussions, more presentations, that type of thing. But we've done sort of one big round of official public and stakeholder engagement. From that, and we'll speak a little bit more in detail about that in a minute, but from that engagement, we are developing a what we heard report. So the province has contracted a contractor that does this type of work where they compile all of the responses, divide them up by geographic, and themes and what the concerns were. And so they are developing that what we heard report for us. That will become a public document available to everybody. We also are working on specific responses to some of the engagement and the feedback that we got, mainly from industry, some from NGOs, some from Canada itself. And so the steering committee is currently working through those responses that we need to have to go back to certain submitters. The steering committee is also looking at any potential revisions that need to be made to this draft plan as a result of the public and stakeholder engagement that we've conducted to date. Our timeline and goal is to have those revisions done by the end of this month, so that we can move through. So I need to take this, me and Doug basically need to take this and Joel through a series of provincial briefings. So we need to take any revisions in this plan to date back to the Northeast Regional Management Committee. That's a committee that houses all the different natural resource ministries within the Northeast region and broader North area. We also need to go to what we call ADM-CNR, which is the committee that has all of the assistant deputy ministers across all of the natural resource ministries in one group. And so we'll go through those briefings. We may need to go a step higher, which would be the deputy minister committee on natural resources. And then there'll be some individual briefings for particular executives, our minister, the new minister of the Ministry of Lands, Waters and Resource Stewardship, on our way to, and so we plan to do that through from September through October, with the goal of doing any revisions from those briefings that may need to be done on our way to the Environment and Land Use Committee. So that is a cabinet submission, essentially. And they sit in November, so they just sit at certain times. The next one that we can get to is in November of this year. If we were to not make that timeline, then our next opportunity, I believe, is in January to bring this forward to that particular committee. So we're pretty close. In November or January, we should have this in front of them for their consideration. So a bit about the engagement that we have conducted. So we had, first of all, we had an engagement portal, which was a provincial online portal that anybody could come through and submit, fill out the forms that were on that portal, and or just submit comments based on, they could read the plan and submit comments based on that draft plan. And so from that engagement session, which was open for, I believe a total of 60 days, it closed on May 20th. So we got 22 written responses. So that was in the form of letters and emails. We got those directly from different First Nations, the PNG sector, forestry sector, so industry, mostly where there are some NGOs. We got a written response from Environment and Climate Change Canada, who oversees the Species at Risk Act, who this planning sort of falls underneath. And then there was opportunity for respondents to just fill out a form that asked a series of different questions pertaining to the draft plan. And so we had 274 submissions through that form on that. And then at the same time, starting about mid-February and through into May, we've held a total of 14 community and stakeholder engagement meetings and sessions. So that's been with Northern Rockies, with the Northern Rockies stakeholder group, with the Northeast stakeholder group, Fort Nations community, and then as well as some others. And so we say here that we've had these engagement meetings and counting, because again, engagement will always be ongoing. We continue to conduct engagement, have more meetings, more presentations as needed, all the way up to the point where we submit this draft plan to the Environment and Land Use Committee, hopefully in November of this year. Some themes that we picked out, and so this is some of the work that our contractor is doing to pull together our What We Heard report, but just some high-level themes that they pulled out. Overall, 53% of people that responded through that portal were supportive of the draft management goals and objectives, that being getting these herds to self-sustaining populations big enough to support a sustenance harvesting level for the First Nations. 66 were supportive of the proposed habitat management measures. So that means the measures that we would actually do in order to achieve those management goals, so attain that self-sustaining population. Those proposed habitat management measures were largely supported. 76% of respondents are supportive of developing a predator management program specific to these herds, to boreal herds. And 80% are supportive of this plan taking an adaptive management standpoint, where it will be evaluated and monitored over time and can be adapted according to that monitoring and evaluation once the plan is actually implemented.
So I have a question for you, Chris. You've got 53% supportive of the draft management goals and objectives. Does that mean 47% were not in favor of the management goals and objectives?
No, there'll be some percentage there. So there was an option there was basically a neutral response, not supportive or opposed to. So there is a percentage, a fairly large percentage of people that were just neutral on that particular one. And then there was a smaller percentage, and I'd have to look back at the exact numbers. I think it was around like 12 or 13% that were essentially opposed to and or just wanted more information on what sustenance harvesting actually entailed and who would decide that and those types of things.
Okay, thank you.
So some other themes that we pulled out of that engagement session is so there were several concerns that were expressed over habitat protection versus a working landscape approach. And largely this comes from industry respondents. So basically what their concerns are is that they would rather than see certain areas of these herd ranges protected from future service disturbance through industrial development. They would rather see it just be a working landscape that they would be able to move around and through, which is essentially what we have right now and have had for quite a long time. And so, yeah, that was concerns over that expressed. There were concerns expressed over the process of industrial involvement. And so this mainly stemmed from CANFOR expressing a concern over the TSA overlap. So just in case to kind of refresh everybody's memories, this plan is specific to the 4 boreal herds within Fort Nelson First Nations traditional territory. There is some overlap, though, of the West Side Fort Nelson herd and Snake Satsune, if I have that correctly, that do dip down across the district line, our natural resource district line. So they dip down into the Fort St. John TSA. There's an overlap of about 25,000 hectares of timber harvesting land base down there. And so the concerns that we got back from those forestry proponents were saying that they had no idea that there was a surprise, essentially, that there was that overlap. And so we've had to go back to them and point out that actually back in 2020, they had all of this same information, essentially. And it was pretty clear that there was an overlap with the northern part of the Fort St. John TSA. At that time, nobody was planning. No forestry company was planning harvesting up there. That's changed, obviously, and so now it's a concern, and we realize that, but they had that information as far back as 2020. There was more detail, expression of more detail sought for the efforts that we're going to make towards restoration, where the fundings come from, how it's going to be planned, what are the target areas going to be, more information expressed over monitoring and evaluation efforts. So what are those monitoring timelines? How are we going to be monitoring? What are we going to be monitoring? Mitigation and offsetting measures. So that is sort of specific to if oil and gas were to come back and create new surface disturbance in areas that are within protection zones, that there needs to be mitigation and offsetting measures applied there. Predator management implementation, people want to know about that. Co-management, how we will co-manage wildlife and predator management and implementation with Fort Nelson First Nation. And access management was a common theme that came up. And then the last one concern that we picked out was the exclusion of management direction for the Chinchaga range. So again, we've said all along that the Chinchaga boreal herd that is totally within the Fort St. John TSA will be planned through other planning mechanisms. It was the Land and Resource Management Plan update. And now I think I'm not sure, I can't really speak actually to where the guidance and the projection is for planning for Chinchaga, but we continue to stick to the fact that it will not be part of this particular plan. And so the steering committee, and when I say steering committee, I mean Fort Nelson First Nation, Northern Rockies Regional Municipality, and the province are working through these responses back to the public and industry on these concerns. Any questions on public engagement or some of the themes or anything like that before we move on to the next subject?
None here.
Okay. So in that case, I will turn it over to my colleague Doug to speak to the PNG and aggregate resource piece.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, actually, I represent simply the PNG resource. Aggregate is something we have to look into. So we've acknowledged that through the engagement that there is, interest in aggregate. There's also other considerations for other mining and minerals, which, though not within the purview of my team, we're looking into with our colleagues here at what we're now called the Ministry of Energy, Mines, and Low Carbon Innovation. I've heard a couple of variations today already, but that's where we're at. So just up front, I want to be clear in what our role is, my role as a representative of this ministry. So we're essentially the steward of the PNG resource, and we're here at this table to ensure through the surface planning process, essentially what it can be defined as, that there is a reasonable level of surface access for existing PNG rights holders within the Caribou planning area. And our approach that we're taking is that we want to avoid completely, if possible, any stranding or sterilization of existing PNG rights. So basically in this area, for the past 5 years, we've seen very little PNG activity. Can be attributed to the depressed pricing climate within the area. We've recently seen a rebound in PNG natural gas commodity prices. So that could, change things from our existing analysis that we've done. And because we haven't heard much in the past 5 years, there's been no new tenures issued within the area. I believe there's been no Oil and Gas Commission authorizations within the last 5 years. So we saw this as an opportunity to prompt those existing rights holders within the area to really tell us their development plans. If they have near term, like next 2 to 3 year plans to develop those rights, we want to hear about it and hear about how it can be done within the context of this Caribou plan. So we're in the process of analyzing the feedback we've received. And based on what we've heard from operators, that there are existing rights within those sort of zones within the plan that suggests that there will be, no new surface disturbance. So we have to develop, work with these companies and really get a sense as to their timing and what tools that we can recommend from my ministry's perspective to allow these rights to be developed, and while still meeting the conditions set out by Canada for the Caribou plan. So if there is, discover that there is interest in developing these rights, offsetting would be something that we'd be looking at. So applying a ratio of some sort for them to offer that 2-to-1, 3-to-1. I'm not sure what the ratio would be. Likely a blanket ratio, I would presume, within the area for companies to come in, develop their rights, and be able to essentially restore a greater quantity of landscape than they would have otherwise. Access management is something just controlling or managing industrial access for an area, and just ensuring that companies are using existing footprints or utilizing the latest technology in terms of multi-pad drilling, directional drilling within the area to minimize any new footprint. Really understanding what variances are in the context of this plan is something that remains to be determined. So if there's consideration for an operator to develop rights using some form of variance, or an instance if it is an activity that contributes to environmental outcomes such as a geothermal operation or climate capture or carbon capture and utilization storage facility of some sort, if there would be considerations for other industrial activities outside of just traditional PNG. I put appended development, so that's essentially aligning forestry and PNG activities to use as best as possible the same footprint, just to essentially harmonize disturbance within the area across different sectors, as well as deferrals, as time deferrals. So if there's a way that we could sequence development over time, and if there's operators willing to consider that as something that we look at too. So there wouldn't be a rush of activity at one time. It could be sequenced over time and monitored and evaluated against the caribou outcomes. So in a nutshell, we're still really in the analysis of processing and analysis phase of what we've heard, and seeing where there's possible instances where there is the potential for stranded existing resources. So we're mapping that out and working with the companies and seeing that what do you need to see from us in order to be able to develop these rights, and while still meeting the caribou requirements, as well as understanding the transportation network in there. So I understand there is challenges with transporting out the PNG resource out of the area. So there's questions a common theme among the feedback received was, what does the existing transportation, what will the impact to existing transportation networks for PNG look like? And should there be renewed interest in the region, how will this plan impede the potential for new transportation networks? So we got a lot of homework right now at my ministry in order to develop management directions for PNG. So that's essentially where we're at. So I'll welcome any questions from the group.
Are there any questions, councillors? None so far.
All right. Thank you for that, Doug. So that moves us into the implementation phase. So this would be once we brought this forward to the Environment and Land Use Committee and received their endorsement to implement these actions. So then the next steps would be the establishment of those legal tools. So this plan, once it's endorsed, there's nothing legal, so it does not establish the legal orders that would achieve the goals and objectives of the plan. That is another process of going through what we call government action regulations, or GAR orders, evaluating resource review areas, land act reserves, ungulate winter ranges, wildlife habitats. So these would be the legal orders that would need to be established in order to actually protect or guide or dictate, how industrial development may or may not be able to happen within these ranges, with the goal of achieving the plan's ultimate stated goals and objectives. Largely a provincial process, but that would be the first step that would need to be embarked on in implementation. Sort of along with that, or once we kind of get through a large portion of that piece of it, we do want to look at what we call population support tools. And that is because we, while this plan is a habitat management plan, basically, we realize that there's probably still the need for some level of population support across these herds or within distinct herds. And so we need to evaluate that, what is feasible, what needs to be done, and what can feasibly be done for these particular herds, while that habitat continues to rebound naturally on its own, as well as once we can start getting, more fulsome restoration planning and activities going on there, which sort of be that the next phase there would be that tactical restoration planning, looking at functional restoration work, ecological restoration work, maximizing the different funding sources. And then obviously there's a host of different types of restoration programs going on. Habitat restoration, critical habitat restoration, there's, orphan wells program, there's legacy sites through oil and gas. That's another funding source. And I think, we'll see new funding sources developed and come, they always change every couple of years. And so managing those funding sources and maximizing that will be a big part of the implementation of the restoration planning and implementation. So I'll stop there for a minute and see if folks have any questions about implementation.
Not seeing any around the table. Mr. Cooper?
So I've mentioned a couple of times before about predator management planning. So currently there is a Northeast Predator Management Plan. It's called Northeast Predator Management Plan to support caribou recovery. That was developed in 2019. And that is something that includes the boreal caribou herds, but it's broader across all the different herds across the Northeast. But it does apply to these herds within this plan. Looking forward, and as we saw from the respondents, 76% I think were support predator management planning to occur. Certainly Fort Nelson First Nation has expressed the desire for predator management planning to be co-developed with the province, and sort of looking forward to that larger co-management of wildlife across Treaty 8 territory and even broader, really across the province. So those are all things that are sort of in the queue and that we all recognize that need to be worked on, evaluated, and planned and implemented as we move forward. And so absolutely the province's intention is to move into predator management planning as we go forward.
I have a question for you, Mr. Cooper.
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. It's Councillor Gerwing. So in terms of the predator management plan, is that going to be a part of the caribou recovery plan, or is it going to be supplemental? So I guess what I'm trying to get at, is it going to be written in the plan that we are going to develop a predator management plan, and this is what it's going to look like, and it's all going to come together and be executed at the same time?
So what can be submitted with this draft plan that we have before us is the existing Northeast Predator Management Plan to support caribou recovery. Within the draft plan, there is language that speaks directly to the need and the intention to do further predator management plan, to evaluate and develop, as I should say, because I want to be really clear here. Predator management takes on different forms, and some forms are super successful in some areas and they're not successful at all in other areas. So I'm kind of speaking towards like aerial predator management, where versus ground programs that may work better in some areas than and not so much in others, or a combination of the two. And so we need to figure out, it'll be pretty quick to figure out which herds we need to focus on, which ones those populations are showing the lowest trends, to see what needs to be done first there, prioritize that. We need to evaluate, what would be effective, both cost effective from the province's standpoint, as well as actually effective on the ground. Is it going to make a tangible difference to those distinct herd populations? And so we have to figure that out. And as we figure out what that is going to look like, then we can start actually planning and working towards what is going to be the most effective predator management activities that we can conduct. That will absolutely require deep engagement with stakeholders, with trapline holders, with guide outfitters, with the general public. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done towards that, specific, and again, I'm talking about specific to these herds or specific to Fort Nelson First Nations traditional territory. So that's not something that we could accomplish before. So I guess if your question is, are we going to not move this habitat management plan forward until we've done and completely landed predator management specific to these herds? That's something we would not be able to do. We need to put forward the habitat management plan and start the implementation of that habitat management plan, and at the same time start working on that evaluation and development of predator management planning specific to these herds. But we do have the existing predator management plan that is an appendix to this, to the existing draft habitat management plan.
Right. So, I mean, I didn't have a lot of time to review the plan and take it to people that are far more knowing than me to review. But when I quickly reviewed it, some of the herds in our area, predator management would not even be considered based on the matrix that's included in the plan. So I guess my concern is a large portion of our community believes that there needs to be a predator management plan to save the caribou. And if that's habitat management plan is step one, predator management plan seems to be like it's going to be a step way off into the future. And a large segment of the community here believes they should be happening at the same time.
I see that Joelle has her hand up. Joelle, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. So just a few things around the predator management planning and potential implementation. There are a number of steps that we'd need to go through, and Chris spoke to some of that. So there is a provincial procedure, basically within the policy realm, that provides guidance to support decisions, statutory decisions related to implementing, so aerial wolf control, for example. There's also a need this year to develop a procedure for a ground predator control, and there needs to be conversations that happen. The plan that is outlined on this slide, the Northeast Predator Management Plan from 2019, is a very good overarching resource. What would come out of an assessment of the ranges, and if there was a range that, a herd that meets the criteria for predator management, which in this case is it's only wolf control, and it's only to support caribou recovery. It's not in support of other wildlife. Then operational plans would be co-developed between the province and Fort Nelson First Nation for implementation. So yes, it's. I guess what I'll also say is, wolf control or wolf reduction, predator management in general in support of species at risk recovery is considered an emergency type option. It's not considered, it's not taken lightly, and there's a huge amount of resources that it takes to undertake that work. So there's a number of factors that have to be considered, and there may be, so there's just, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's steps that need to be taken. They will start to be taken this year. and to see whether or not any of these ranges could support wolf reduction program.
Councillor Penny.
Listening about the predator management program, and I only hear of wolves being mentioned. I'm just wondering, is there any other predators that are being considered in here? I know I've read some reports from up in Alaska that they had absolutely no idea how many calf caribou are being consumed by roaming grizzly bears. So, and we know that our grizzly bear population is increasing exponentially up here. Just wondering if that's part of the predator management planning, at least, to look into that and see how many we're losing to grizzlies.
It is not at this time, no. Grizzly bears in BC are also a species at risk, so it's not. Pardon me. Oh, so, and we understand, and we've heard from a lot of folks, both in this region and elsewhere, that grizzly bear numbers are on the rise. But in general, in boreal caribou habitat, and certainly the further east you go within the range, grizzly numbers are thought to be, or the grizzly density is thought to be fairly low across the majority of boreal habitat. Now, that may not be the case in and around Fort Nelson itself and up in the Max Hamish or west side Fort Nelson, as you get closer to the mountains, but it is not being considered right now. Wolf control is underway across 13 herds in BC, and there is some cougar management as well in the far south.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, Mr. Cooper, if you want to continue.
So then the next thing was just to talk a bit about socioeconomic assessment. So this is the table that we put forward in all the public engagement, all the presentations that we did back in the spring, which is a breakdown of what is available or what could be available if industry were to return, and using, largely just looking at forestry and petroleum, natural gas industries as to under this plan, if it were to be implemented as is with the current line work, what would be available from a forestry perspective, how that translates into jobs, tax revenue, stumpage, and overall GDP. And then from a petroleum natural gas perspective, I think we did amounts rather than values, I think largely because the value of oil and gas is so volatile that I think it would be inaccurate of us to just, or it'd be arbitrary of us to just stick a dollar figure on it, not having any idea of what the value might actually be if exploration were to return. So what we looked at is, under this plan, same thing like forestry, what would be available for access and development if that industry were to return at some time. And then Doug, I see you got your hand up.
I just want to add to that. So these values represent the value of the entire play, essentially. If there was, unrestricted access and every single last hydrocarbon was extracted from the ground. So if we presented this to highlight to stakeholders as well as internally that there is the risk of foregone development, foregone revenue, and the associated jobs and opportunities that come with that. So just essentially it's a snapshot, a very high level snapshot, just showing that there is resource potential that remains, that would be potentially lost if this plan prevents that from happening. So just wanted to highlight that.
Mr. Borhill, it would be nice when you're briefing the assistant deputy ministers to at least be able to put some kind of a number on that so they can understand the impact on the region from when they look at reducing the amount of petroleum and natural gas extraction, what the impact would be on the provincial coffers. And I know it's hard to put a number on that, but I think it's worthwhile to try to quantify the amount of money that the provincial government is looking at foregoing in taxes on that.
Absolutely. So we're actually looking at that now. So we've updated this information, as I understand it, predates my arrival to the ministry, and I think it's based on 2019 information. So we're looking at it now, looking at, Oregon, the bonus bids that we received from the sale of the tenure, the royalties that the province would receive, and then just the overall value of the resource itself from known identified reserves within this region. So that work's underway, and we're updating all information. And also I acknowledge that, prices have improved since this analysis was done. And there's the potential for, increased interest in the area. So there's lots of factors that are, going into our analysis now, and we'll be reporting out on those shortly.
Thank you.
Okay, and that was the last slide that I had for this deck. Just want to see if there's any other questions or any more conversation that council would like to have.
Any further questions for Mr. Cooper or Councillor Penny?
I'd just make one comment that I like the fact that you had mentioned that there will be more engagement community, but next time that we do some engagement, I'd like to see it happen at a more reasonable time, that more working people could attend some of these sessions and maybe happen in an area that they're more familiar with and maybe feel more comfortable coming out to, maybe like our rec center and on an evening or something like that. I do believe the last one I attended was in the morning in a smaller room somewhere. So just a thought to consider next time you do some engagement up here.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Any other questions for Mr. Cooper? All right. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Take care, both.
Admin report number 59. Ms. Thompson, Boreal Caribou Protection Recovery Plan update.
I only brought up part of my stack. So good evening, Mayor and Council. So I prepared for you a report in advance of the presentation that was just provided to us from the Ministry of Forests, just to identify some areas of key interest to the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality. A lot of the background information was presented by the Ministry of Forests as far as some of the results that came from the public engagement. There are a few pieces that we just want to highlight as far as those key considerations. So one being first and foremost the socioeconomic impact assessment. So as was provided by the Ministry of Forests, there has been some information contained in the draft plan around socioeconomic impact from the plan itself, but it's strictly related to an AAC, so an annual allowable cut reduction, versus how many jobs we think we might lose based on that reduction of AAC. Since 2018, the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality has underwent various reviews, primarily completed by Stantec, to look at socioeconomic impact on these boreal caribou plans and how they may affect industries, specifically the forest industry, and then later the oil and gas industry. Those assessments were completed on a previous plan. The BCRIP plan was developed in 2017. The plan is much different today than it was then. And the baseline information that was used in those plans is much different as well. There was also some information that was provided by the province from 2017 that was also used as a baseline. So I just want council to be aware of that. When we provided Stantec with the information that's in the current draft plan, they had responded to us that they were unable to complete a review without digging deeper into some of these background documents. So we've put that forward for council's consideration of whether or not to spend additional funds to have a more fulsome socioeconomic impact assessment completed. because the current information in the Boreal Caribou protection and recovery plan is, as you saw tonight, fairly high level. So the other piece that we want to talk about was predator management. So Ministry of Forest provided some information related to the 2019 Northeast Predator Management Plan. One of the key items that we wanted to highlight in that one is definitely agree with the province as far as what that will look like. There's a decision matrix that obviously will need to be followed to determine which herds are candidates for predator reduction. What's not clear to us is the role that Northern Rockies Regional Municipality may play in that process. Respectful of the relationship between the province and Port Nelson First Nation to develop those plans. But there was also comment made about further stakeholder engagement and deep engagement with stakeholders such as trapper associations, guide outfitters, but we're not sure as a regional municipality if we fall into that group or a different group, or if we're looking to possibly have a defined role in that process. And then last but not least, plan implementation itself. So once the plan is approved by the minister, whichever ministry that may be, there are going to be economic implications to some of the activities that are going to occur through plan implementation. So things like restoration work. We heard when we were up in Toad River an interest of, employment opportunities in restoration work. So again, not entirely sure where Northern Rockies falls in as far as plan implementation, but definitely feel that there's a need for us to have a defined role going into the process. So I'll leave it at that for council.
Any comments, councillors? Councillor Souls.
One thing that is troubling about high-level plans, and of course, this is a plan that has to be submitted to the feds and so on. It's great to establish a plan with expectations of success in the operational side of it. That's great. But what if you actually establish a plan that doesn't have effective mechanisms for rehab and so on, and you start to see a continued decline in numbers and so on, simply by having maybe in the plan chosen the wrong actions and so on, or lack thereof. And then you now have the framework for the reduction in land use. That could be, if we find that the plan is unsuccessful in the earlier stages, then more restrictions on land use could become the next step, as though like to perpetuate the problem further rather than to fix the actions necessary to make the caribou survive. So I just think that as a Northern Rockies, I've wondered what angle we can take too, because what role we can actually fulfill within this. The socioeconomic is one that is really obvious that we need to keep that one front and center, because it's a point of contact that we can have. And so I was just curious and wonder if anyone else has thoughts on the issue of how we can monitor this plan as it goes forward to see whether this plan is working. We put a plan into place. I mean, we have to approve this to move it forward. They're going to go without us, with or without us. So we have to approve this. Is there a way that we can have a role, or even if it's a self-made role, in monitoring the success of that plan, so that we always have input to protect us from further encroachment on our land base?
So one of the things that the draft plan does propose is that adaptive management approach. So that provides the province with some flexibility to be able to change approach, which is one of those implementation pieces where it's important that Northern Rockies would have some input, because you're absolutely right. You don't want to get into a situation where we now have this framework, and now through adaptive management, the province needs to kind of change it, but we don't have any input into what that looks like. So yeah, that's definitely the crux of it.
Councillor Penny.
I just wonder, we're looking at 14 years since we've had any amount of forestry industry in our area. We've been 7 years without any new oil and gas activity. If we're still declining in numbers, I think we've figured out two things, two things that are not really having a huge effect on it. So that's big things that I try to point out when I've attended these or when I've submitted anything. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
Any other comments? Councillor Andrews?
Yeah, I have to agree with that too. And they always talk about the calendar range. There's really been zero industrial activity in the calendar range, but there's still a dwindling caribou population. So now, like you said, Councillor Penny, we've got 14 and 7 years of industrial activity not happening, not expanding, and our numbers are still going down. I know the importance of social economics, but this predator management needs to be pushed forward. The amount of people who tell us that you can't do one without the other, where are they getting this information from? I'm sure it's been proven somewhere. Let's get the information out. Let's start blitzing. I think that we need to do it just as bad as we need to do the environment side of it.
Councillor Gerwin?
So I have so many concerns, I don't even know where to begin. But like when I read the predator management plan, it's not really a plan. It isn't a plan. To me, plan has action, and this doesn't have action. It's a, well, maybe if perhaps, well, that's what I got out of the plan. Like, for instance, it says that, so we have 5 herds in our territory. If I read it right, correct me if I'm wrong. But out of the 5 herds, this plan, using its matrix, only recommends that predator management is available in 2 of the herds. And one was the Chinchaga, which then Chris just said the Chinchaga is not part of the plan. So the other one is the west side. So out of all of our herds, there's only going to be one that this 2019 plan recommends might be a possibility. So it's, to my way of thinking, it's really not a plan. It was just like, and the other thing in the plan, if you've had time to read it, like the research is old. Like it's 2008, 2007, 2000, like I think the 2019, was there 2019? 2014, I think is the most recent research that I could see in there. Like it's all old. And then the other thing that I really take exception to is that the last time Chris Cooper was here, and he admitted that the numbers that they're using aren't numbers that they've gone out and counted. It's like some kind of a matrix or something, like they, have taken this research and then they've adapted it into some kind of formula. And if this happens and that happens, then you're going to get 6. But you know what? So I really don't understand their numbers. I don't understand how they get through their numbers. And I really liked the report. Thank you very much. That was, that we're discussing right now. And I see, like, I think I identified 4 actions in here that you would like for council to consider. So I would very much like to move forward on all 4 of those. And when you're ready, I could make a motion.
Okay. Some of these items were things that we brought up with Josie Osborne, and one of them was the lack of good scientific evidence for the number of herds and the counts that they're doing. And it's like you said, Councillor Gerwin, their formulas. They're just not accurate counts. And I think I had heard someplace that they had collared 2 caribou at one time, and they were trying to draw some conclusions from what happens to 2 caribou. And I don't know what year that was. It might have been 2016. But I don't think the numbers are accurate. I don't think they're putting enough emphasis on getting accurate counts. So all their other assumptions don't hold much water if they don't know what the situation is. So I would agree, Councillor Gerwin. There's $15,000 in $14,000 remaining in a budget here. Was that to be used for socioeconomic study?
Yeah,
And-
anything to do with basically this planning process.
Okay, and was that included in one of your 4 items that you are very well? So Councillor Gerwin, would you like to make that motion, please? Then?
I would make the motion then that we move forward on to solicit Stantec to do a deeper review of the relevant source documents to develop a report that better describes the potential socioeconomic impacts of the BCPRP on the forestry and PNG industries.
Seconder for that. Seconded by Councillor Penny. All those in favor? Carried. Councillor Gerwin, that encompassed all the other 3 points as well that you were speaking of?
I know the other point that I identified is in the report, Regional Council has continued to express the need for a predator management plan as part of the draft BCPRP. So I think we should move forward in ensuring that the province knows that. I don't know if all of council agrees, but I see them as running like in tandem. I don't see it like, okay, we're going to do a land management plan and then we're going to study whether we're going to do a predator management plan 3-5 years down the road. Like we all know how long all of this takes. So if the rest of council agrees, I would support staff and council moving forward with coming up with a plan to ensure the province knows how we feel about that.
Any discussion on this?
I would say that even using the province's graph of 76 in the what we heard section of 76% supportive of developing a predator management system. And if you actually use Chris's description of the possibly neutral votes and so on, it doesn't actually mean that there was 24 that were opposed to it. So you have a very wide majority of what they heard is that predator management matters. So they're acknowledging that they got a very wide representation from their responses. So I think that to emphasize that, I agree that that's a good idea. And I think that the issue, I appreciate the question regarding, and the comment, Todd, regarding grizzly bears, because the black bear is the other culprit and it does its work. And those animals need to be part of the discussion. And we need to make sure that they're part of the discussion.
I'll ask for a seconder for Councillor Gerwin's motion. Seconded by Councillor Souls. All those in favor? Carried. Councillor Gerwin?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so that would include where the report goes on further to say that the province clarifying what role the NRM stakeholders and public may have in the development of the predator management plan too. And then my third point that I saw in the report was, given the ongoing implementation and monitoring of the BCPRP holds significant implications for the socioeconomic future of the NRM, Regional Council may wish to consider further information concerning plan implementation and the opportunity the NRM will have to actively participate and influence that process. So that would be my motion.
Seconder for that motion, please. Seconded by Councillor Andrews. All those in favor? Carried.
And then my last point that I identified in this report is that we seek additional information concerning the implementation of an adaptive management approach. Like, what's that going to look like? What's our role?
Seconder for that motion, please. Seconded by Councillor Andrews. All those in favor? Carried. And all those motions passed unanimously. Thank you. Any further comment? Thank you, Ms. Thompson.
Just want to make one little comment there about the grizzly bears. I was just trying to find that report, the last report that I read, the study that did in Alaska. I think I've mentioned it to you guys before. They thought maybe traveling grizzly bear ate a caribou or two in their whole movement. And then they put cameras on several of them and they found that they're eating 1 to 3 a day as they're traveling. So, I mean, we're talking about a huge number. Anyway.
This report actually has quite a bit of good information, particularly around the rate of mortality from wolf kills. So it's exacerbated by things like linear features and climate change, but wolf kill is the primary source of mortality. And it's in this report that the province just referred to.
Thank you. Bid report number 60, land acknowledgement, Indigenous relations. Ms. Jacobs. Ms. Shepherd.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. So Gabrielle and I are returning tonight to provide an update on the land acknowledgement framework. As you know, work started on this in August of last year. Council provided direction for collaboration with Indigenous communities and stakeholders to develop potential land acknowledgements. An informational update was provided in December, and after which an interim land acknowledgement was reviewed and adopted by Council in February. Following continued engagements, a draft land acknowledgement framework was developed and reviewed by Council at the end of March. At that time, next steps were to return to conversations with our Indigenous community engagement partners in the region to share the draft framework, and then to incorporate their perspectives and feedback into the framework and return to you with these learnings. So as outlined in the report, there have been many discussions that have taken place to discuss the draft framework. And tonight we're here with a revised land acknowledgement framework. I'll pass it over to Gabby and she can talk about that.
Thank you, Hillary. So as Hillary noted, tonight we're seeking feedback from Mayor and Council on the revised land acknowledgement framework, as well as steps to implement the framework going forward. So as Hillary noted, we have met with a number of Indigenous governments and organizations throughout the course of the past year to develop a framework for Council's consideration. The report before you it's intended to reflect the feedback that we've received through engagements over the past few months following our last meeting on March 28th. So since then, we have had the opportunity to connect with a number of Indigenous governments and organizations across the region. We have not yet had the opportunity to connect with representatives of the Kaska Nation to date, but would welcome that opportunity when it arises. So I'll just bring up a copy of the framework before you, just as the attachment. So you'll note that in the framework that was provided most recently, we've taken the opportunity to restructure some of the document based off of the feedback we'd received. So generally, we've taken the approach to provide further context for truth and reconciliation, both within Canada and British Columbia. Subsequently, we've noted how local governments can be involved in reconciliation and steps that they can take to support such actions. Subsequently, the framework provides us a brief overview of the development of the framework, just noting that it was developed in collaboration with Indigenous communities and organizations across the region, and just taking the opportunity to thank those that provided input and guidance throughout the process. You'll note in the following section, we've provided, again, a high-level overview of the Indigenous communities within the region that we are aware of. And you'll note that the information or the descriptions included in this section perhaps differ amongst the various Indigenous communities. I think this is a reflection of the feedback we'd received, and perhaps a reflection that each of the Indigenous communities within the region are distinct. And with this information, the perhaps high-level overview or summary of the Indigenous communities that we're aware of in the region, we have used or incorporated that information to then develop a few sample land acknowledgements that you'll find later in the document.
And surrounding that section, we've provided a few notes or perhaps best practices to consider when incorporating or providing an acknowledgement. And that section is largely developed based off of feedback we've received through our various conversations. So you'll note that within the framework, we've provided 5 samples for your consideration. And then we've chosen to conclude the document by providing a few recommended resources for those interested to access should they choose. So perhaps I'll pause there and just ask if there are any questions at this time.
Councillor Souls.
I just have a question about what connection we have in the Northern Rockies with the Doig River First Nation, and how did that come along?
Right. Let's go to that page. So initially we sought feedback from Flynn Ward, Ministry of Forests, and they provided guidance to the regional municipality on which Indigenous communities within the region assert traditional territory in our area or within the boundaries of the regional municipality specifically. So through some of that high level guidance, we had some indication of who may be appropriate to reach out in starting some of our initial engagements. From there, we did make contact with a representative at Doig River First Nation, and they provided further information on how Doig River First Nation is connected to the land base in Northeast British Columbia, or perhaps more specifically within the boundaries of our municipality. Our understanding at a high level is that Doig River First Nation's traditional territory extends north into perhaps the Northern Rockies regional municipality into our boundary. That being said, perhaps some of the more detailed information around asserted traditional territory or areas of consultation by either the Government of Canada or Government of British Columbia is held in confidence, perhaps between a nation and the Crown itself. So we've been provided some high-level information, but from there, we've chosen to connect directly with the communities to gain more information.
Any other questions? Councillor Gerwing.
So thank you for this report again. So if the report is accepted or the land acknowledgement framework is adopted by regional council, would we still have flexibility to adapt any of these sample land acknowledgement statements, or would we have to use what's provided here?
Thank you for your question. So it's anticipated, the framework is generally meant to provide some sample acknowledgements so that one can craft their own meaningful acknowledgement. And you'll see through those sample acknowledgements that they are, each has a bit of a definition as to what it is including. Some are a place name, some might be a broad land acknowledgement. So they're there as samples designed for each person to be able to meaningfully craft their own based on their maybe own experiences, and through a review of the framework, maybe have some other ideas of ways to incorporate other learnings or experiences into the land acknowledgement.
Okay, that's great. I really appreciated how the samples were connected to like a larger group, or and where, when. So I appreciated that. Thanks.
Any other questions?
So I'll just jump in there. Thank you, Gabby. As discussed, the framework provides an overview of the known Indigenous communities in the NRM and provides some sample acknowledgements, as we were just mentioning. It is anticipated that should the framework be incorporated broadly into municipal operations, it would encourage understanding of the histories, cultures, and languages of Indigenous communities within the region. And it's within this increased understanding that there is greater opportunity for further acts of reconciliation and support of Indigenous peoples. Additionally, as you've seen in the report, there are several recommendations to engage in reconciliation and relationship building with Indigenous communities who have enduring connections to the land in northeastern BC. The NRM does currently engage with Indigenous communities in some program areas already, as you're aware of, such as health and agriculture. And additional opportunities include connecting have been outlined based on guidance from conversation with our engagement partners over the course of developing the framework. Some of those might include incorporating the framework into municipal operations, such as orientation packages, project planning and events, as well as a commitment to review the framework and consult with Indigenous communities for revisions, continuous efforts to build relationships with Indigenous communities through collaboration and inclusion in municipal projects and events, integration of Indigenous perspectives into municipal bylaws, policies, and processes, and regional council and staff actively seeking opportunities to participate in or volunteer at Indigenous-led events, including celebrations and training opportunities. Yeah, so the recommendation is for the land acknowledgement framework and recommendations outlined in the report to be adopted into municipal operations as part of the NRM's commitment to reconciliation and in support of stronger relationships. Thank you.
Councillor Andrews.
Just one question. I have troubles figuring out how to pronounce some of these names. Is there a way we could have it written in there, like the pronunciations? Like I know when you go online, sometimes they'll have it written in a different way, so it's easier to pronounce. Is that like an easy edit we could do to help me out and maybe other people?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. At this time, work hasn't taken place to get a phonetic pronunciation guide, but it's anticipated that we would be able to further our connection and relationship building, maybe work towards something like that.
So in the acknowledgement, I notice in many places they refer to the treaties. So they acknowledge that they're on the lands of the Treaty 8 or and I notice this doesn't refer to the specific treaties. I guess what I'd like to see is a reference to the treaties of the region and the fact that these are peace and sharing treaties in the acknowledgement. And those are about my only two comments. Councillor Souls.
I would like to echo that in the sense that I'm hesitant, I'm reluctant to agree to the using each of the historical names at all, not because of the language or the pronunciation, but simply because there's a fair level of internal division on those topics within our own region. Not in our people, but in the Indigenous peoples. And therefore, let's be more general in how it is. We want to have full acceptance of all and be inclusive. But if you start singling out certain ones, you right away have this conflict come to your own doorstep.
Councillor Penny.
I feel that the steps that we've taken over the last, I think, year or so, in engaging with all of the nations in our area. The whole point of this was, though, we weren't really making that decision. We were reaching out to see how these peoples want to be acknowledged. So I feel very strongly that this framework that's been developed has been done so through great collaboration with all the communities within our region. And so I would be very happy to move forward, bringing the framework adopted into regional council.
Councillor Andrews? Councillor Goering?
No, I'm good. I think that within this sample, there are samples that, would address Councillor Souls' concern and Councillor Andrews as well until we get better practice on specific pronunciations. And then I think that something could be adapted to include your own mayor. I think we have the flexibility to, and I think that's what First Nations are hoping for. It's not just a blanket statement that we all used every meeting and we've all been there, right? It's the same, but we get to, make it a little bit of our own and make sure that it's, it's heartfelt and that it's, so I think that those options are available to us. So I would make the motion that the option 1, that the land acknowledgement framework be adopted by regional council.
I'd second that motion.
Moved by Councillor Gerwing, seconded by Councillor Penny. All those in favor? And that passes unanimously. Thank you.
So excuse me, was that just for option? Because it's not option 1 and option 2. There's 2 different motions we'd want there, right? So I would make the motion then that we also incorporate option number 2.
Very well. Moved by Councillor Penny, seconded by Councillor Gerwin. All those in favor? Carried.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good catch, Councillor Penny. Very well. Since we're at the end of business for Special Regional Council, I'll declare this Special Regional Council meeting adjourned.